do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion, can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to episode 7 of Murdocracy, a podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of News Corp, the most influential media company in the Western world. I'm Cam Wilson.
I'm Sami Shah.
Hey, Sammy, how you going?
I am doing good, actually. Pretty happy, even though things are scary here in Australia right now. And, as you know, we live in a prison state and we need the Americans to come and free us. And so basically I'm spending most of my time kind of coordinating the behind the enemy lines kind of, resurgency that'll hopefully help the American invaders defeat our dictatorial governments.
Yeah, brushing up on your guerrilla war skills.
Yeah, but that's just standard. Everyone's always got to keep practicing. It's good for cardio, if nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. And hey, have you finished up your list of demands to agree to a net zero target for the government?
Look, I'm still with my party room. We're negotiating. We feel we don't want to be rushed into this. We've only had around 9 to 10 years to kind of figure things out. It's not enough time. I was a bit busy having an affair with someone who worked for me. And so, I just got caught up in all of that and having multiple kids and things. You know how life is.
Which, funnily enough, is actually one of my demands, that's okay. So just want to make sure I get that in there as well.
Be allowed to have an affair with an employee.
So, another big week for news on the News Corp front. We will be talking in a little bit to Gabby Makata, who is an academic who has dissected News Corp's net zero campaign in a really, really smart way, and I'm looking forward to chatting to her. But before we do, let's go on to News Corp's News of the Week. So it's time to break some news here on Murdocracy, and I've got a little scoop.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Rudd's campaign for a royal commission into News Corp and Murdoch is actually growing into a new stage that hopes to mobilise the more than 500,000 people who have signed the petition. And being announced today, working with the Victorian Trades Hall, the campaign is employing Sally Rugg, who, I don't know if you know her, she worked for Change.org, but kind of rose to prominence when she was running the Yes campaign for the same-sex marriage postal survey. They'll be trying to push for a royal commission, or failing that, or in addition to that, in fact, some other potential policy changes. Sammy, how do you think that the actual campaign has gone so far when Kevin Rudd started up now quite a long time ago to try and get some change in the media landscape?
Well, it's really interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot recently, seeing the coverage around it. And I think Kevin Rudd, and this might be my analysis only, but I think Kevin Rudd was realistic going into this about what he might be able to achieve in terms of actual policy change, because I, like many people, am skeptical that we might see any policy change. But the media coverage of it and the public perception that it has helped to foster and create, I think has been interesting. More people are now talking about News Corp's role in Australian politics openly, publicly, and without it sounding like a conspiracy theory or partisan politics line than before. Or maybe that's just my bubble. Maybe that's within my bubble, which of course is a media lefty, inner city Melbourne bubble. But I don't know. I just see more and more instances of people talking about News Corp and how it's influencing Australian politics from across all sides of the aisle than I did before. And I think maybe that was Kevin Rudd's original plan, and this seems to be escalating that a bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. 500,000 people signing anything is an incredible achievement, particularly about, a media company, which, in the scheme of things can really be something that isn't super obvious to people.
Yes.
Like, I don't know how often people thinking about the company that owns the newspaper that they're reading or the television station that they're watching. It obviously is such a big issue. That's why we do this. But to me, it did surprise me that so many people were into it. Not that people care about it, but like just that it was that wide.
Mhm.
I do think so far it how it has gone since getting those signatures, it did stall a little bit. Like we've got this Senate inquiry, which we'll chat about in a second because there's been some new developments on that front that was brought into effect by Sarah Hanson Young, who we spoke to as well. And that had to kind of broaden out. It couldn't just be, or at least it wasn't just into News Corp. It was into media diversity in Australia. Clearly it is focused on News Corp and really used that, but it wasn't just News Corp. And as a result, that wasn't, I guess, in a way, almost like the perfect outlet for this momentum. And so this campaign, which they have launched, has been kind of looking for the next step. Like, what are they actually going to do with this energy? And it seems like this campaign that is, this stage of the campaign that's now being launched will be actually that next step, and we'll try and use that to try and to do something. Because at the moment, I think that getting it into at least a Senate inquiry has kind of, I don't think, the average person is tuning into the Senate inquiry. What they're trying to do is say, well, can we actually do something a bit more substantial with this? And getting someone who is spending their full time organizing this, I think, is a great step towards that.
I think it's you're right. It's what do you do with 500,000 people who are interested in something? And I think you're right. Mobilizing them towards something like this, the options are limited. You either do something, which is what Kevin Rudd clearly has thought about carefully with Sally Rugg, who's very qualified at mobilizing people towards creating social change. Or what's the alternative? Is, I guess, setting up a Nixon style, sex cult or something, or maybe a private guerrilla army, But yeah, we got to do something with them because they're right there. We have their email addresses now.
And an interesting thing, actually, though, is, and this is getting into the weeds, but I'm sure people will appreciate this, is that so the 500,000 people who signed, they signed the House of Representatives e-petition, which is how you can write a petition to parliamentarians. But because it was actually done through that doesn't actually allow whoever organizes it to access all the contact details of the people who signed up for it, unlike other petition platforms. So actually, although there is 500,000 people who signed that, who said, I'd love to see something done about News Corp, we should look about potential regulation, whatever. Now that they're there, that energy is kind of diffuse because Kevin Rudd actually can't send out an email to everyone who signed that petition. He did actually build up some kind of other digital infrastructure where he has, as I understand it, got quite a lot of emails, and I know that the details of this campaign will be sent out today as part of that to those people. But it does kind of show actually, like, even when you have so much energy, if you're not thinking about how it will actually be used, you can kind of hamstring it. And unfortunately, I think that's a little bit how it's done. That being said, I'm sure all the people who heard about this campaign in the first place will still be interested, are probably following Kevin Rudd or someone on social media who will tell them about it. It's not like they're lost forever. But right now we see a concerted effort to go from, Kevin Rudd, he used this, essentially the e-petition as kind of a set piece. But now I think we're seeing a kind of more strategic use of other kind of infrastructure to say, well, what can we actually do to mobilize people to try and get some change? The question is what the change will be, and I think we'll have to wait and see what that is.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds further.
We were speaking of the Royal Commission just before and the push for it. What we got and said, as I mentioned, was that Senate inquiry into media diversity. And it had another hearing this week that featured a big name, one that we've mentioned a few times on this podcast, Robert Thompson, who is the CEO of the Global News Corp Corporation. He was grilled for just under an hour by Senator Sarah Hanson Young, Kim Carr, Andrew Bragg, and there were a few interesting tidbits that I want to share with you, Sam. The first one was he spoke about the meeting that he had with Scott Morrison in New York, and he claimed that they did not talk about their net zero campaign by 2050. He said actually the campaign was coordinated by local editors, had nothing to do with him, had nothing to do with the Murdochs. And when Scott Morrison, who went to New York, knew that he had Glasgow coming up, knew that there was a push for 2050, knew that News Corp was kind of trying to pave the way by running a campaign, apparently it just didn't come up.
I don't know whether that shows that, I think, well, okay, here's what I think. He's trying to show that, look, it's not a concerted campaign in which we influence the government and all of these things. And, his attempt there is to show that, look, the government's independent. They do what they want. Scott Morrison, it's not a priority for us. But I think it comes across more as, why aren't you talking about that? Why wasn't that one of the top things you talked about? How non-seriously do you take this issue if you have the ear of the Prime Minister of Australia and you're not even bringing up the net zero campaign?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, look, these Senate inquiries, people know that they aren't supposed to lie to them, but they can be very, very tricky and specific with their answers. And he said that they did talk about Glasgow, but he said that he didn't talk about the net zero campaign specifically. But maybe they talked about generally
what on earth else were they talking about regarding Glasgow? Like deep fried Mars bars? Like what could the conversation have been about other than that?
Just nice things to see when you're there. Good eats to have, places to stay. Yeah. He did actually mention they talked about a bunch of other things, including Australia's little stoush with the French, and a few other things as well. But he said it was almost entirely international politics, which is interesting. The Senator didn't actually ask. Sarah Hanson-Young was questioning at the time. She didn't actually ask what domestic politics they discussed, but I guess we'll just have to leave that a mystery. Another thing that they spoke about was Robert Thompson really kept the focus of his responses, his opening remarks and his answers on big tech. So he opened up by talking about these Facebook files, which was this big investigation that came out a few weeks ago of all these documents showing how Facebook knew about a lot of the negative impacts their services were having, but hadn't done enough to deal with it. Robert Thompson also talked about how much bigger Facebook is than News Corp, and he argued that big tech is actually the biggest issue facing media diversity. So very intentionally, he was trying to frame this being like, hang on, News Corp isn't the issue here. You should be looking at these guys over there.
I've got the introductory remarks, the opening statement he made at the Senate inquiry right here. And it's really interesting the way he kind of phrases it. He goes, firstly, the digital ecosystem is dysfunctional. While there's undoubted diversity, there's not yet sustainability. Even in new media, 10 smart women and men could launch a news website in Birmingham, England, or Birmingham, Alabama. And no matter how, I don't know why he focused on Birmingham, and no matter how clever or how canny, they would be doomed because content is not properly valued and the digital ad market lacks transparency. I was thinking about this because I'm watching Impeachment, the latest season of the American Crime Story drama, which focuses on the Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? And a big part of that story is Matt Drudge and the Drudge Report, which was basically a guy who just started a website publishing rumors, became a global sensation and influenced American news, American media, and American politics. And the question remains, can you see something similar today? And also, should you see something similar today? So it's interesting. He kind of goes down that road. Now, obviously, the thing and a lot of people can criticize him for is saying, look, he's just trying to distract us. He's saying, we're not the problem. Look, the problem's over there. And that's not to dismiss the fact that there isn't actually a problem over there. The digital media and Facebook and social media and everything are a problem. But the way he's framing it, I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not sure whether 10 smart people in Birmingham, Texas, Birmingham, England, Birmingham, India, wherever, can start a website and have it, be influential in the whole world is a good thing or a bad thing still. But his idea seems to be that, look, big tech is what's stopping it from happening. I don't know. I think, also mainstream media has also stopped that from happening for a very long time as well. And as we've seen in small town newspapers and small town publications.
Yeah, so I'm an internet reporter and I spend a lot of my time thinking about big tech. And I am personally very receptive to what Robert Thompson was saying about big tech. I think that there are huge problems and we do need to be doing something about them. And so, when he's talking about ad tech, when he's talking about sustainability of newsrooms and digital media, I'm like, yeah. But that also doesn't entirely excuse you. And
yes.
it's very beneficial when you're talking to lawmakers, the people who are responsible for regulating, to point out that actually we're not even really that much of a big deal. You should be looking at those guys, like the people over there, not us. What I would recommend is that we'd be looking at both of them. I think is probably the answer. And we've covered this before. We're really beating this dead horse. News Corp and the tech platforms have these remarkable relationships where News Corp is riding on the back of the success of these tech platforms. They have managed to get money out of them. They've managed to get partnerships where it promotes their content. When big tech is doing well, News Corp, almost out of all of the media companies in the world, is doing well along with them. So, and that's the interesting thing is in Robert Thompson's answers, he also took the time to say, I quite admire Mark Zuckerberg, and I thank them for paying us. They have slightly softened their tone on big tech because they are getting good stuff out of them. They don't want to completely burn the bridge, but what they are trying to do is continue to get policymakers, the people who are making regulations, to look at big tech rather than them. And if in the process they can also make things a little bit better for themselves as well, that's just great. And then there was one other thing which I thought was pretty cheeky, actually. So the Mission Zero, the News Corp's Net Zero by 2050 campaign, also came up from Senators Carr and Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. And what they actually used it to do was not to thank News Corp for its sudden progressiveness on climate change. They actually used it to say, well, we talk about media diversity and you say there's more media diversity than ever before. Then how do you explain the fact that all of your major mastheads just decided to do a massive climate change campaign? What does this show about the lack of media diversity in Australia? And I think, unintentionally, it proved their point. Clearly, News Corp, in the opening remarks that Robert Thompson made, he made sure to mention, this campaign. He knew that he was speaking to a committee that has a Green senator, a Labor senator, who are, trying to push the government at the moment on climate change. So he was playing to his audience. But unwittingly, I think it did actually add a little bit of fuel to the fire, being like, if all of a sudden you can make this radical editorial shift in a coordinated fashion, it kind of actually does prove the point of your critics.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was very clever. Turning off I suppose turning of the phrase is the wrong way of describing, but turning of the agenda put forward by News Corp to be used against them. But also, I saw them do the same thing. I saw Robert Thompson do the same thing. Where, if you remember, Vice had come out a few weeks ago with an entire coverage around how News Corp itself internally is a very carbon neutral organization that aspires towards carbon reduction. He mentions that within his own opening speech. He goes, look at how great News Corp does when it regards to reducing reductions internally. So it's very interesting to see how both Robert Thompson and the Senate inquiry are both using News Corp's behavior and actions, very recently covered, as weapons to defend it and to hurt it, or attack it rather. It's kind of fascinating. One of the other things I found really interesting was he uses the phrase neo-Malthusian ramblings.
For those of you not familiar with the term neo-Malthusian, I think it's the idea of population control to limit climate change, which is a kind of it's actually kind of an eco-fascist point of kind of argument that we should reduce by often undetermined methods the amount of people, so that we have less of a consequence on the environment, which is, we can get into it, but is actually kind of a bullshit argument.
Yes.
I do find, though, Sammy, when News Corp is brandishing its environmental the achievements it has made, its own personal corporate progress, that we have said we want a carbon price, in the early 2000s, that we have all this solar. That is the moment for me when the credibility stretches the most, because I'm like, you guys know exactly what you're putting to air. You guys know that even if you're doing this behind the scenes, that's nowhere near as the consequence that you have had on discourse in Australia in the US, in the UK, I guess as well, about environmental action to deal with climate change. And, like, we try to be fair. We try to say, like, there's great stuff that comes out of News Corp. And, there's always you can always still be critical about climate action as long as it's, done in a way that is contextual and makes sense. But when they do that, I'm just like, I find it very, very hard to accept that they can say that with a straight face.
Absolutely.
And finally, the shortlist for Australian journalism's top awards, the Walkleys, was announced this week.
I just want to interrupt over there to say, congratulations, you're on that shortlist.
Thank you. This was not in the script. How dare
I know. I was just like, I don't know how you don't mention it, because it is pretty cool that I'm now doing one of us on this podcast at least is a Walkley nominated and potentially Walkley winning journalist. So continue.
Yes. Anyway, you can't see my cheeks are red, but we'll continue. The Guardian's Amanda Mead reported that notably absent from the Walkleys nomination this year is Sky News Australia, which, unlike all the other TV stations, had not a single nomination. She said, perhaps it's the David Spears effect. Spears was the network's shining star, winning 2 Walkleys for his interviewing skills. And the Sky News won a Walkley in 2016 for its election coverage, which meant handing an award to journalism for Tony Abbott's former chief of staff, Peter Credlin. So they didn't get any nods from the Walkley committee. The other notable absence I saw was that Sharry Markson did a lot of coverage on coronavirus, on China's involvement in it, that were really promoted by the Australian. She's now written a book about it, and I noticed that they were not nominated either. And so we can't know whether they weren't whether someone didn't nominate them, which is why they weren't shortlisted. But it did strike me as rather odd that these big stories that people have questioned the credibility of, but were really promoted as international breaking scoops, were not recognized at all by the Walkleys committee.
Well, I mean, look, neither was any of the work I've done. Now, some would argue that I have done nothing that would be worthy of nominating or even submitting to the Walkleys.
Sammy,
but clearly it's a bias within the Walkleys.
Here. Another
well,
snub.
I've never submitted to the Walkleys. Well, yeah, yet another snub. But maybe they're waiting for Donald Trump's book review of Sharry Markson's work. But
I wouldn't hold your breath on that one.
Yeah, look, it is telling, though, that David Spears, who was what can be described as a more centrist journalist, as opposed to someone with a more, obvious bias, that a lot of News Corp journalists have been criticized for. The moment Spears leaves, the Walkleys leave as well. I wonder whether they're going to look then towards finding someone to replace that gap, and then therefore getting back into that award consideration, or just running a concerted campaign against the Walkleys and how left-wing biased they are, and thus destroying the Walkleys' credibility with their fan base.
I think if I'm not mistaken, Sky News hosted the Walkleys last year, so I don't think that, and that's because I think it was telecast during coronavirus, but I'm not sure that it would be quite a heel turn for them to suddenly go from supporting it to saying that it's a left-wing institution of the elites. But look, we've seen further stretches of the truth before, so maybe that is in the offing.
And as always, we like to take a look at an example of good News Corp, bad News Corp. So this week's good News Corp is one that I found, which there's a bit of an irony in there as well, but I'll give it credit. It's Katrina Grace Kelly's column in the Australian this week, which starts with "US has no right to point the finger at our handling of COVID," which I don't know if you've seen, but we've got a lot of Americans suddenly deciding that Australia needs to be liberated, including very famously Ted Cruz, Republican senator from Texas, who sent out a tweet saying, "I love Aussies. Their history of rugged independence is legendary. I've always said Australia is the Texas of the Pacific." Really? Have you? Really? Who has ever said that? "The COVID tyranny of the current government is disgraceful and sad. Individual liberty matters. I stand with the people of #Australia." Today we've also seen Candace Owens kind of come out and say that Australia needs to be liberated, and America needs to send an army in to free the Australian people. And basically Katrina Grace Kelly's written a really nice column that kind of pushes back against the ridiculousness of it all. She also, in that column, defends Victoria against all the all the
Oh.
insinuations that we have these African gangs running the street. An insinuation, by the way, that the newspaper she's writing for has helped push for many years. But that's regardless. Overall, she says that, the amount of COVID cases we've had, the amount of deaths in COVID we've had, the way we've handled the entire thing actually points to us being a far greater success story than America can ever hope to be. And we're better off without America pointing fingers at us. So it was a defense of Australia in the face of American, stupidity that I found refreshing in the papers of the Australian, given that, it's a kind of Americanism that normally gets pushed in the papers of the Australian by their editorial columnists.
Exactly. I wonder what their US correspondent, Adam Crichton, who is very much a booster of America's COVID response and the hundreds of thousands of deaths. I wonder what he thinks of it. I guess we'll.
Adam Crichton, I'm still convinced is just a 4chan bot that's got a profile picture. And so that's the good news Corp. The bad news Corp we have is Des Horton wrote this for the Brisbane Courier Mail. And it's probably not going to make Des very popular in Brisbane. Or maybe it will. And the headline is Opinion. I'm ashamed to be a Queenslander. We are Australians first and Queenslanders second premier. You are embarrassing yourself, right, Des Horton? And the basic summary of it is that, he's angry with the Queensland state government, doing all the things it has done to justify its protection of Queenslanders from COVID, like the border closures, etc. And he says, I'm going to read over here a quote. He goes, I've come to the unhappy conclusion that I'd rather live in New South Wales than put up with the deceptions any longer. Sydney appeals. So does Armidale. So does Victoria's Yarra Valley. I've rejected Melbourne as a relocation option for fear of being cut down in gangland crossfire. Once a Queenslander, always a Queenslander, Des.
He is News Corp royalty. In fact, his son is the digital editor for Sky News Australia. So they are he has long been a stalwart of News Corp in Queensland. So his threat to pull up stumps would take away some of the heft of their of our Queensland friends, who I know you're very fond of.
Oh, you know how much I love Queensland. By the way, I always joke. I mean, it's a beautiful state with the dumbest people in the country. That's fine. LNP Senator James McGrath, that's another quote, called the OIA the Gestapo of local government in Queensland. Agreed. That's the last line of the column, which is basically less a column, more a collection of tweets, really, if you look at the way it's written. So, yeah, that's a very, very standard old school News Corp publication.
Exactly. And I agree, Sammy, bad take. We should be proud to be Queenslanders if we are, am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, if it comes down to it, I will defend Queensland if America ever invades, just as much as defend Melbourne. I just want to put that out there. If you're as mystified by News Corp's sudden change in focus on climate change, where it's gone from being critical of it to suddenly advocating for man-made climate change and net zero and all these things, then maybe Dr. Gabby Makata is going to be able to help a little bit. Gabby Makata is a research fellow in climate change communication with the Centre for Climate Futures program at the University of Tasmania, and also lecturer in communication journalism at Deakin University. So 2 hats being worn, both of them perfect for what we want her to ask her about. Thank you so much for joining us, Gabby.
That's a pleasure. Good morning. Hello.
Gabby, you've worked as a journalist, but you've taken that hat off and you're now primarily, or you are an academic. Can you take us on a step back to look at the bigger picture? What do we know about how people learn about climate change generally?
Yeah, it's a good question. The crux of it is that most people get their understanding of climate change from the media, which means that whatever conversations are going on, whatever discourses we're seeing in the media are really important for the way that people understand this really crucial issue that confronts us and needs such profound and also very rapid solutions. So the way that the media frame climate change, generally, any media, really has an influence over how people understand climate change, what they think about what needs to be done, and their acceptance, I think, of any measures imposed by governments or measures that we decide to take personally in order to reduce our impact on the planet. So it's really important, really fundamental. Media construct our reality. They construct what we understand to be true. And so the way we see climate change as a debate play out in the media is really fundamental.
How influential has their particular stance on climate change been, in your estimation?
So the Murdoch media, the News Corp media group,
Mm-hmm.
yes. Well,
Yes.
I think both consumers of media and people who study it like I do, in fact, I do both, would have noticed for many years the particular stance that News Corp has taken. So I think it's probably quite well known and well accepted that there's been a climate contrarian or indeed a climate denialist stance that we've seen from News Corp for well over a decade, almost 2 decades. That's been well established in public commentary and research. And, we've seen particular terms being applied to those who argue for climate action, things like those arguing for climate action being called alarmists. We've heard them being called loons, crazy loons, people that are doing, advocating for change on climate change, that they've got warming hysteria, if you like. It's also been called, so climate change has also been called a cult of the elite. And commentators from the News Corp stable have also said that the effects of global warming have really proved largely benign. So we've heard that kind of rhetoric. But also in 2019, we've heard Murdoch himself say that there are no climate change deniers at News Corp. On the other hand, we've also, in a long-term way, we've seen News Corp outlets effectively campaign against Australian leaders who have tried to move forward action that we need to see on climate change, putting a price on carbon pollution and so on. Malcolm Turnbull back in 2021, earlier this year, said that News Corp is in fact the most powerful political actor in Australia. And it's certainly been implicated in toppling several of our previous prime ministers as a result of their climate stance. So incredibly powerful. And a profound influence on both the climate debate and our political culture and the way politics plays out in this country.
Gabby, when you first saw about this campaign, I'm not sure if you saw it in 9 papers or when News Corp itself published something about it, were you surprised to see them, do this heel turn?
Personally, I was surprised. I first saw it. I'm coming to you from Hobart, and I first saw it in the Mercury, which is a News Corp owned paper down here in Tasmania. What that paper had, as all the other News Corp tabloids did have on the first day of the campaign, was a 16-page wraparound for the usual publication of the paper. All dedicated to climate change, which was absolutely a first and quite astounding. So I don't usually buy the print version of the newspaper, but I bought it that day.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to see, how did you see News Corp selling its campaign? Because, straight up it said, not only are we doing this campaign, but here's what we're going to do. How were they trying to frame their role now, I guess?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You can see this online still, and this came through also in the print publications. Basically criticising, the 3 major political parties for their roles in not having been able to successfully bring in any controls to carbon emissions, and saying, well, we're the adults in the room and we now will solve this. And so this is our solution. We're going to put solutions forward. So this is News Corp suggesting that it, after all these years of climate denialism, can make a change on climate change. So that was really surprising, really, really surprising. And then also what's been surprising is after years of saying that the necessary changes that we need to make to cut emissions, that these changes would be a job killer in Australia, and that a carbon tax would be, or decarbonisation would be too expensive. That it tagged, so News Corp tagged decarbonisation for Australia back in 2015 as costing $600 billion. There's There's a complete about turn on this now. So with this campaign, the Mission Zero 2050 campaign, as it's called, now saying that that decarbonisation could be a potential windfall of $2.1 trillion for Australia, and that would offer 672,000 new jobs by 2050. So a complete about turn, at
bit of a
least on
turnaround.
jobs, and at least on the economic ramifications of decarbonisation.
So at this point, we seem to be getting the thing we've all been hoping for so long, which is the News Corp finally stops denying climate change, man-made climate change, starts getting on the right side of history, starts advocating for the change we need. Why aren't we happier about this? Why are we so cautiously skeptical, if I may?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's been a lot of commentary in the media actually about what this all means, why it's coming now, and how should we feel about this about turn? I mean, one of the things is that there's no mention in the new campaign about what News Corp's done in the past. So there's no mention of the company's years of intentionally undermining decarbonisation, and no mention of the way it's helped to topple Australian leaders who have advocated for climate action. So those are really loud silences, if you like. And also, it hasn't muzzled its commentators in any way. So people like Andrew Bolt were very quick to come out and say this campaign is rubbish. And even my own company's against me now, but I'm telling you the truth. And equally, News Corp hasn't aligned its advertising particularly well with these new messages, because on the third day of the campaign, the Herald Sun, for example, ran a half-page ad by the Climate Study Group, which is a climate skeptical in quotation marks, sort of right-wing linked climate science discrediting group that talked about the great climate change furphy and was discrediting climate science in that ad and advocating for more coal and nuclear power. So we can discern in the general narrative, now that we've seen 2 weeks of it run out, we can discern some particular sort of tropes, some ways of talking about climate change, which do show that there's a bit of a business as usual push to this.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that, because that's the thing, the top level is that we were doing something about climate change now, but of course there is so much within what comes under the category of climate change action. And, knowing what we know about, the IPCC report that came out recently telling us the kind of drastic action that we need to take. What did we see from what they were trying to put forward? And they said, we were just going to do positive messages. What are the positive messages about?
Well, that's exactly right. They've said, so interestingly, the campaign, in fact, one of the sort of campaign bylines is about putting Australia first, which may sound positive, but we need to point out that any effort to deal with climate change has to be inherently global, because it's a global issue. So there's that. But then there's also, if you dig a little deeper, you'll see that despite the sort of glossy feel of the campaign and the fact that it has taken a positive stance on the fact that now climate change, mitigating climate change can be good for Australia in terms of job creation and actually economic growth, there's a bit more if you dig a bit deeper. So what we've seen is a defence of basically Australia's small amount of emissions compared to other countries, especially China, which, therefore suggests we don't need to take the drastic action that other countries need to take because our emissions are smaller. And that's a very old narrative we've seen in media and in climate delay tactics for a very long time. That's still there. We've also seen a lot of talk about renewables in the campaign, but there's also been some framing of renewables as an unreliable source of energy. And therefore not an adequate replacement for fossil fuels. There's also been talk about how Australia's coal is cleaner than other countries' coal, which some of it may be cleaner in the sense that when burned emits less carbon dioxide. However, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, in a major report earlier this year said that all countries need to start quitting coal now if we're to stay within safer global warming limits. Of course, sort of backing the gas-led recovery rhetoric that we've seen from the Morrison government, The campaign also promotes gas and promotes it as having half the emissions of coal, which is correct. However, burning gas, although it emits less carbon dioxide, it allows for fugitive emissions, which means emissions of methane itself that escape during the extraction process. When that gets into the atmosphere, it's 30 times more powerful as a heat-trapping gas than carbon dioxide over 100 years. So there's that. And then we've also seen quite a lot of advocacy in the campaign for CCS, carbon capture and storage, which means trying to capture the carbon dioxide that's emitted when burning fossil fuels. This is not yet a proven way to reduce emissions from burning fossil fuels. It's not feasible at scale. And we've also seen, of course, criticism of the carbon pollution price. And economists widely agree that this is the most effective way to encourage polluters to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we've seen that old trope also rolled out. And finally, and maybe most surprisingly, the campaign does make a big effort to spruik nuclear power. So, and this is quite surprising. It says that, we should be using nuclear, that our aversion to it defies logic, that we need it for national security as well as energy. And so that has actually been quite a large focus of the campaign as well. Despite the fact that that modelling shows that this is just not going to be an appropriate way to decarbonise our economies and reduce emissions in time for the end of this decade, as we need to do. So those are some of the kind of the tropes and the ongoing business as usual rhetorics that we've seen.
So I'm going to ask you to do something which you might be uncomfortable doing, but I think it's worth it as a thought exercise. Just speculating, why do you think they're doing this? I mean, have they been convinced by the growing evidence? Rupert Murdoch has said more than once that he himself is not skeptical about climate change. We've seen stories coming out about climate change related policies being made within News Corp about how News Corp runs itself. Have they seen the evidence and decided, what, this makes a good point? Is this a good thing, or what's their motivation, you think?
I think it's a really good question, and I am happy to speculate about it. I think that it's probably quite clear. It's two or three things. The first is public opinion. Public opinion polls on concern about climate change and the push for action on climate change in Australia show that, and have consistently shown over several years now, that always above 70 and sometimes into the 80% of Australians are concerned about climate change and want to see action. So it's a vast majority. And so News Corp's rhetoric that we've seen on climate change is simply out of sync with what most people think and what most people want to see. And so you've got to work to your audience, work to what the public mood is on issues like this. So I think that's one of the reasons for the about face or the U-turn. And the other is, of course, that advertisers are what make a media outlet profitable. And so if you are, if you're spouting kind of rhetoric that is not palatable to the majority of your audience, you're also going to be losing advertisers who aren't keen to be aligned with that kind of position on climate change. So I would say those are two things. And then thirdly, of course, as we know, Scott Morrison right now is trying to negotiate with the Nationals ahead of the COP26 conference to at least be able to take a very minimal offering of a symbolic commitment to reaching net zero by 2050, at least that. And so I think this campaign has been positioned right now to show the Morrison government that this most powerful political actor in Australia, as Malcolm Turnbull has termed it, will not now campaign against a net 2050 goal, and so that Morrison can go ahead and make that declaration. So I think those are the three key reasons for why we're seeing this now.
Gabby, do you know anything about how audiences would understand these messages from the campaign? Like, I know there's studies done about what kind of messaging changes people's minds around these kinds of things. The narratives that you discussed before that have been rolled out as part of Mission Zero, do you think that they will be effective in making any change? Like, is there an argument that their kind of, I guess, fairly pedestrian pace on this may also be more palatable to their audience who may already be kind of climate skeptical?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think some parts of the audience, they're quite large national public, will be baffled as to what's actually going on. Why this, why now, why the about face? And I've seen some commentary on social media that's really slammed the campaign. So some people are not happy about it. Others are probably baffled. I think that certainly the media has a really important role to play in educating people about climate change. And if people are getting their main information on climate change from the Murdoch tabloids, then certainly they stand to learn more and to know more, which is great. But I'd also like to add that climate skeptic portion of the Australian public is actually really small. Audience segmentation studies have shown that around 10% or even less of Australians are truly climate skeptics or climate deniers and don't believe the science of climate change, despite the fact it's very much settled, especially since the last IPCC report that you mentioned. So actually, Australians do understand what the issues are and they do want to see action. And that minority that doesn't is a small minority, if a vociferous, a loud one.
That was Dr. Gabby Makata speaking to us about Mission Zero, News Corp's Net Zero by 2050 campaign. Sami, that's it for this week. We should do our usual reminders. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, just about anywhere. And please come and join our little podcast Facebook group. It's Murdocracy Podcast, and we pop things in there throughout the week. So, you can keep on the conversation going there about News Corp.
Oh, one thing, one of my friends told me that he couldn't find the Murdocracy podcast, and the Facebook group rather, and I realized it's because he's spelling it Murdocracy with a CH at the end of Murdoch. Yes, even
course.
I realized that. So it's Murdocracy, Murdocracy podcast.
We drop the H.
Basically, we drop
Keep
the
it
H.
tight.
Yeah, absolutely. Or H, if as we used to say back in WA. Yes.
Thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the theme music, Ruby Innes for our artwork, and of course, thanks to you, Sami.
Thanks very much, Cam.
Bye.
Bye.